edition of the Value Exchange podcast. I am here today with my usual host, Rob Pye. I'm not going to ask him to say hello for the last two or three. He just ignores me, so I'm moving on. We're also really happy to be joined by Chih Hoong Sin, who is an international expert in social outcomes for contracting for social outcomes and impact investing. Has done a lot of work with governments across the world: UK, DCMS, Middle East, Japan. Worked with the UN, worked in UNESCO, and we really wanted to pick his brains about that impact investing and contracting for more social outcomes as part of what we're doing. But first, we'd really like to know a little bit more about you, who you are, where you're from, why you do what you do, and as much of your story as you'd care to share with us. And we're happy for you to talk and talk and talk and talk.
You're going to regret that open invitation. And thank you so much for having me, Annabelle and Rob. And after that warm introduction, the check's in the post, Annabelle. The check's in
It's all
the
your words. It's all your words. I stole them.
post. Brilliant. Well, a bit about me. So I'm Chih Hoong Sin. I've only actually just recently, for the past 6 months, gone independent. So I'm freelancing now. Previous to that, I was a director at Traverse, that was formerly known as the Office for Public Management, OPM, and I ended up being chair there before I left. And where did I come from? I was born and bred in Singapore. I came to the UK in 1993, so this is my 30th year in the UK. So I've spent more of my life in the UK than in Singapore. And it's just been a bit of a ride where I started off, I came here to do my undergrad and I stayed for my postgrad. And then inertia sets in and I'm still here. But then other than that, I'm always very curious about everything. So it's very difficult to describe what I do because, I do a bit of research, evaluation, stakeholder engagement, organizational design development, social investment, etc., etc. I've been an academic, I've worked in charities, I've worked in the civil service, I've worked in the private sector, and now I'm on my own. So I think I'm just a restless person, and I'm always curious and nosy about what other people are doing.
But having worked with you a bit in the past, Chi Hung, and also talked to you about Singapore and worldwide stuff, and that one of our favourite questions is always, why have you done what you've done? And for me, there is a central um, theme in the story about social impact and provide doing something with meaning and really getting under the skin of that. And so the question is, why do you do social impact? Why do you do impact charity? Where has that come from? Most people, they're not used to rehearsing that question out loud, and that's one of our ways to really open up these discussions. Where did that come from?
So I think it's about my overriding driver in my life, personally and professionally, is passion. So passion was the reason why I ended up here because in those days in Singapore, you couldn't do a degree in geography. So there's no such thing as doing a degree in geography. And I've always been passionate about geography. So I came here to do it. And passion, I'm always led by passion. I always think if you don't get out of bed excited about what it is you're doing, why bother? And personally, professionally, I'm passionate about things like social justice. I'm passionate about things like public value. So, my PhD, my undergrad has always been about race and ethnicity. I looked at segregation, from the inequalities point of view, segue into aging, also from the diversity, equality point of view, and inclusion, disability, etc. So things about social justice, about social cohesion is really, really important to me. And you can't be in that, you can't live that without being dedicated to outcomes. Because, in the equalities field, we're always talking about outcomes isn't just about equal treatment or equal opportunity. It's about equality isn't just about equal treatment or equal opportunities. You have to look at the outcomes. And it annoys me that to this day, we're still talking about things like, oh, we've spent so much money on this, as if that explains anything, right? That, oh, we just invested £5 million into this policy program. And, what happened as a result of that? Did people's lives change? And why are we still having these reports about institutional racism, sexism, homophobia, when every inquiry over the past 30, 40, 50 years have come to the same conclusion, making the same recommendations? How much more of these and how much more, from the research side, how much more evidence do you need before you do something about it? And that's what annoys me, and that's what fires me up to want to be in there trying to do what I feel I can do, whether it's from academia, the third sector, the civil service, public sector, or now on my own. It's about believing in our agency. Sometimes when the world looks like it's falling apart and problems look so big that it creates apathy because people don't think there's anything they can do to change that. And I don't believe in that. I believe, things that we use things like the economy as if it's this abstract. But the economy is all of us and our behaviors that constitute what we call the economy. So it takes all of us doing something about it, changing our behaviors. So we must never lose sight of that belief in our agency, in our interdependence with other people. We are all interdependent. Um, and if we work together, and that's why I believe so much in collaboration. But I always believe all that must be underpinned by passion and authenticity. Because the older I get, the less time I have for people who are not passionate about what they do. Sorry to say this, but that's it.
So I've got about 100 questions that has just been stimulated by what you said, which is wonderful. And I mean, this podcast is called what is it called, Annabelle?
The value
Value,
exchange.
the value, and we've kind of taken this word value exchange as a noun and a verb and an adjective and any other, because it's like you are a value exchanger, because you believe in your agency to do, and our mission is to try and encourage people to share stories of how they derive meaning. And it's something that is about reflection on what we've done and actually how we've derived meaning and what we'd like to do more of and what we'd like to do less of. And of course, when you chunk that up to outcomes as a word, we can think like economists and we can disembody an outcome to a number like GVA or GDP, gross value add, gross domestic product, or whatever. But when it comes to what is it like being me, Chih Hoong, Rob, Annabelle, anybody, that's quite a subjective thing in terms of, well, I might be unemployed, but I'm so happy, I'm creating, I'm doing, or actually, I feel racially excluded, discriminated, disadvantaged. And I really, really don't, I want to do that. I want to be that. I would like more of this. And often those things don't chunk up to an economic indicator, like a government might look at, minimum wage, living wage, number of hours of employment, or a number. Whereas maybe it might chunk up to a story. And I'm just going to ask you a hard question now in terms of having done this for so many years, your reflections on outcomes that matter. What are your reflections on outcomes that matter?
I think there's just so much confusion when we talk about outcomes. So, I'm sure at some point in this podcast, you're going to talk to me about social impact bonds. And, you
Okay,
might
yeah.
remember,
Shock horror.
yeah, shock horror. I read your minds. But, years ago when all this first started, the social impact bond agenda started, I remember being one of the few voices at the start that kept asking that question about whose outcomes. You're all saying you're paying for outcomes, and the first wave of social impact bonds in this country and elsewhere are just all what I called system defined outcomes. So these are the outcomes that are important to the system. So to government departments, to public bodies that are paying for them. And yes, these are important outcomes. They are important to the system for a reason, such as efficiency, such as cost savings, etc. But if that is all we mean by outcomes, then this whole outcomes agenda is never going to have traction because it is completely divorced from you and I, from our lived realities. We don't think cost avoidance to the state by a child not going into care. We think about that child, that child and his or her future, their families, what they're going through. We don't think about the cost of crime in terms of the cost of incarcerating people in prisons. We think about the cost of crimes in terms of what does it feel like to be a victim of crime? What does it feel like to live in an area with high crime rates, et cetera, et cetera? So I've always said there are different layers of outcomes. And there are the system things, there are the system outcomes. We're not saying they're not important, but at the individual level, how do you and I look at things that are important to us? What are these outcomes that are important to us? Why are they important to us in those ways? And then at the community level, what are the outcomes that are important to communities? And then at the system level. And sometimes these outcomes don't line up neatly. Achieving outcomes at one level might actually conflict with the outcomes at another level. But I think that then just opens up a more honest debate about why do we as a society or as a country choose to do what we do with the resources that we have at our disposal, rather than pretend like everything that's well intentioned will be good for absolutely everyone. And we're not even going to go there in acknowledging contradictions. And therefore, there's a real lack of transparency because we have never really unpacked what we mean by thinking outcomes and doing things that are outcomes oriented or focused.
Yeah, I'm so glad you put that down on record because we'll point people to this segment when anyone talks about the word outcomes or any other word, for example, that we might use, any word, we kind of need to get behind the word to the meaning that we each ascribe to our language, our symbols, and say, well, what do we actually mean by that? When we started Ethos, believe it or not, Chih Hoong, it was in 1999. Annabelle, myself, and another consultant called
I
Tony
know I'm
from
not that young. I'm not old enough to
no,
have
no, you're
started.
not old enough. She
No,
was like
you're not old
she wasn't born. She wasn't born then, but we called it See People, and C was for community and collaborate and lots of other because we were a bit bored of stripping the people out of the e-business because it was in the year 2000. It was all e-business, and then we renamed See People Ethos in 2000, the
2010,
2010,
2010, yeah.
2010, and it's Ethos Valuable Outcomes. EVO is the organization, but still we talk outcomes, and But so I'm so glad that was a very important unpick. So now I'm 15 or 16 years old, and I want you to explain what on earth a social impact bond is.
Well, first thing, and you would be bored hearing me say this, it's not a bond, right? Because a bond conjures up this image of it being a financial instrument. So, like you buy a government bond, and a bond means you can trade it on the financial market, buy and sell. It comes with an expected defined rate of financial returns at, published timescales. So it's got all that financial and time certainty. But a social impact bond is a misnomer in that it's not a bond at all. It's not a financial instrument. It's basically a form of delivery contract. So you're contracting someone or some organization, a provider, to deliver usually a service and intervention, etc. And that is all being paid for, not necessarily based on what they do or how much they spend or how many people they work with, but it's all being paid for in terms of the outcomes that are being achieved. And these outcomes are defined right at the start. So you don't make it up. So it's about outcomes that are defined at the start, that you can find people who are willing to pay for those outcomes. Now, it's a delivery contract in that it pays for outcomes wholly or partially on the basis of outcomes. That's not unusual. What makes a social impact bond unique is the involvement of private capital. So we draw in private capital from this third group, which is, the social investors. So they come up with the upfront costs for setting up, running, delivering the intervention. And it's only if the desired outcomes are being achieved, usually at certain threshold levels or beyond certain threshold levels, then the people who are interested in paying for outcomes will pay the social investor. So they don't pay the service delivery agents, they pay the social investor. It's a social investor that comes up with the liquidity for the delivery agent. So under that model, it pays on the basis of results and outcomes. And theoretically, the financial risks are therefore shifted onto the social investors, away from the outcome payer and away from the delivery agents. So I hope that's clear.
Yeah, I mean, it is to me, but Annabelle, is it clear to you?
Yeah,
I,
yes, it is
I,
clear to me. Yes, I wasn't clear before the meeting, but now I feel I understand. Um, so
and
yes.
what's your prognosis, Chih Hoong, in whether this? I mean, we've had other forms of private finance, like PFI,
Pe-
Private
mm.
Finance Initiative. Is it going well? Where in the world are other countries adopting it? Do you think that the prognosis is good in terms of as a means for financing outcomes from government?
I think it goes through phases. So I think you would know that the UK was the first country in the world to bring out something called a social impact bond. And that was 2010, the Peterborough Social Impact Bond on, recidivism, reoffending.
Mm.
Since then, now I think at last count, according to the Government Outcomes Lab's Indigo database, I think we have about 276 of these kinds of instruments around the world in I think more than 35 countries now. And why do I say it goes in phases? Although the UK was the first to bring it out, and the UK still has numerically the most number of social impact bonds, but I get the sense that in recent years, the government has perhaps lost a bit of interest. And that is why Big Society Capital, the wholesale social investment entity in the UK, has been trying to persuade and influence central government, especially since last year, to not take its foot off the pedal. And certainly, it's not about doing more social impact bonds, but it's about not losing that learning about what has worked, what hasn't worked, how can we build on that learning. And in contrast, I work in jurisdictions internationally that are now really inspired by this whole idea, this whole model that came from the UK. And, I have to say, are taking it in ways and directions that probably put us in the UK to shame, in that they're being far more ambitious for what this idea can do than we have become in the UK. So what do I mean by that? I think the UK, we we came up with this innovation, and then very, very quickly we locked in that innovation and just started to want to replicate models. And that to me is just lazy and complacent, because I think we've barely scratched the surface of what this idea can do in terms of servicing outcomes and really generating outcomes at scale and in a sustainable manner. But all we did was lock it down and say, here are these models, let's replicate them because we are more interested in reducing the development costs of these models. So let's try to do it more efficiently, cheaply. Um, and unfortunately, we tend to still use this idea in the UK largely around efficiencies and savings. That's always been the case from the first social impact bond in the UK. And now, when I speak to the field about what next, will people be doing more social impact bonds in the UK? A lot of people tell me, a lot of local authorities, clinical commissioning groups, etc., said that if they've been doing a social impact bond until now, the initial business case um, was usually approved on the basis of cost avoidance. But they're saying now, moving ahead, if they do something like this again, it will be near impossible to pass to approve a business case on cost avoidance alone. And people are looking for actual financial savings because of, how prolonged and deep the austerity in this country has been, and now austerity 2.0. And that is discouraging because you see other countries like Japan that are using these ideas and models not not about efficiencies or cutting spend. They're using it to explore how can we generate greater societal well-being. And one of the good things about working internationally is you can bring that learning back and challenge ourselves. So here, when I speak to people about why are we doing these things like that with such a limited view about just the financial drivers for saving money, and normally I just hear the rationale being because of austerity, because there's no money, money is being very tight. And so, having worked in Japan for, since 2015, I can push back and said, well, the Japanese national debt is 288% of GDP,
GDP.
more than our national debt, more than the UK national debt. But they are using this instrument we invented not to bring about financial savings, but they're using it to actually generate greater societal well-being. So if this driver that you says in the UK has motivated us to develop this way, I can equally tell you the same driver can motivate people to do some other things. So it is not predetermined. The context doesn't predetermine how you employ these ideas. And that's why I say in the UK, we've barely scratched the surface of it, because this idea is not about the money. This idea is about how do you use the money creatively, always to try to challenge ourselves to change more lives for the better. That is the idea. That is the creative challenge. It's not about how do we make the money stack up? How do we make sure we make money out of it? How do we make sure we save money out of it? That is not what the idea was about. The idea is about how do we change lives for the better. And if private financing is needed, how do we best use that to change lives for the better at scale? So it goes in waves. Other countries are more inspired about doing this. than we are. So in Abu Dhabi, where I support the government there, and we co-designed and launched the first social impact bond in the Gulf region, you know, they were using that social impact bond actually to transfer a type of expenditure away from private households onto the state. So that social impact bond is about really how do we best support young people with learning disabilities to achieve an education and to get into and stay in employment. So that is what the social impact bond is about. But when you look at what's been driving it in Abu Dhabi and the United Arab Emirates, there are no accredited professional development for people who work with young people with learning disabilities. Highly variable quality, and it's very luck of the draw. Can your family afford to pay for
Mm.
someone to support your child? And even if you can pay for someone, there's no guarantee that person has the qualifications or the training to do this. So, but the government looked at this issue and says, well, no, inclusion of disabled people is a national priority. It makes sense for the country. Inclusion is good for the country. Why are we making families pay to try to get some semblance of opportunity for the disabled child to be more included? This is not fair. This is a societal responsibility. We have this obligation to our citizens. So they are using the social impact bond to do something very different from what we are doing. We're trying to shed public expenditure to bring it down. They've actually, said there's something wrong with the picture right now. This shouldn't be a private cost to families, and it shouldn't just be down to whether or not you can pay. We have a responsibility, if we believe inclusion is important, which we do believe that, to then do something as a country about it.
Yeah, and I think almost the conversation is broader than social impact bond in that,
Absolutely.
reminding me of previous interviews on the value exchange where we talked to Tony about system change, and we talked to Guy Standing, who's he's world-renowned expert on universal basic income, and he so passionately, much more than I could ever do justice, argued so eloquently for basic income because it's just the right thing to do. And I think almost that the whole world, but certainly the UK, is stuck in an efficiency trap. When you talk about
Absolutely.
outcomes, you talk about, well, how can I do what I do for less money? And then you've got a million silos all thinking that way, and nothing happens. And that contrasts to what we used to call a public health approach, which is, a preventative approach, and say, well, wouldn't your A&E be much better if people were not the same people, frequent flyers coming every week, because of something that you could have done, whether that's schooling in the community upstream, but a preventative health measure, well-being measure to actually reduce. Now, I've got a story of a more than one NHS chief exec who manage thousands of people, but have less than £10,000 discretionary spend to do anything that is not efficiency. And certainly, even in that silo, if it was, I'd like to do something with schools, um, that hasn't got a business case or an outcome anywhere near my hospital, but I'd like to do something in social justice or adult social care in the community, it would be almost sort of like, well, that's fraudulent. That's your job's not that. Your job is like doing that. So again, my brain has gone all over the place, Chih Hoong. Thank you. You've
No, but Rob,
thrown
just
any
picking up
go on.
picking up this point about efficiency, I think there's a lot of conflation and confusion out there, though. I think the government rhetoric, the policy rhetoric likes to use the word efficiency, but actually, the word efficiency is used to cover up a whole array of sins. Like, actually, this is cost cutting. Cost
Yeah.
cutting does not equate to efficiency. Because if you look
No, we've
at,
heard this before. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
and so I teach a module for clinical innovators in the NHS on how do you demonstrate your economic value. So it's like economic assessments. And one of the things I always say to the students is if you change resourcing here, if you're looking at efficiency in the way it should be looked at, any changes in resourcing here, you've got to trace where is it felt in the wider system. And efficiency is about having that overarching bird's eye view of what's happening to the whole system. And that's why what you were saying, Rob, earlier about system change, a system integrated picture of how you look at these things rather than departmental silos or even budget silos within departments is so important. But our system here isn't structured to do that. We've had how many years and how many different experiments in, co-commissioning, in pooling budgets. I still remember, the total place pilots and the learning from that. And, now we have got integrated care systems, et cetera, et cetera. And we're still grappling with basically fundamentally the same problems that never went away. And we just tinkled around the edges and we just think restructuring solves a problem. It doesn't. It threads through so many things. It's not just structure alone. We often talk about culture, but also I think risk. How do we manage risks across public services? We do not have a collective risk management approach. So therefore, no one dares to do anything different from what they think the book says, because if anything goes wrong, it's on their necks. So we don't even have this collaborative system leadership that helps steer us through what is increasingly a fragmented public service commissioning and delivery system, although at the same time we keep using the language of integration. But when you're actually looking at what's happening on the ground, it's actually increasing fragmentation. So how do people navigate their way through this mess?
And Annabelle, go on. Questions?
No, I'm just feeling the I'm back to where you started, June, which is about keeping people at the center of the outcome at the end of the day. And I feel we've all, certainly Rob and I, have experienced with elderly parents, the system and how it is hugely fragmented and not working. And last week, when we were talking to someone who, quite a senior surgeon in the NHS, he was talking about sort of the change fatigue. This was the major thing for him all the time. So that tinkering that you're talking about is just, it's not solving anything at all. And what I felt as a sort of a human being on the receiving end of these services is that I don't feel that I am a human being. I'm just and I don't, it's just not about the people. It's just the system that they're in is not functioning in a way that's allowing them to, either operate and then, in a really cool world, bring about improvement as they experience the requirement for improvement. So yeah,
And the
it's really
tragedy,
interesting.
the tragedy then is this rationing. Either the system explicitly rations through, thresholds, etc., or we self-ration. And the people like you and I, we have got the knowledge, the confidence about how the system works. We can assert for ourselves and for other people. And just very, very recently, last summer, my left eye started to go red and I couldn't figure out what was happening. I couldn't get an in-person GP appointment, so I had several virtual GP consultations. and they thought it was infection, so it's prescribed all these things that didn't work and made it worse. And in the end, at the third virtual consultation, the GP says, we recommend you go to A&E at Moorfields Eye Hospital. I can refer you, but actually going through the referral route will take forever. So it's better that you self-present at A&E. So, that's already one sign of how the system isn't working. So I went to A&E. Turns out I had episcleritis, which is an inflammation, not an infection. So I was prescribed all the wrong medication before that. So I had steroid eye drops that I was supposed to take a month. I did. It kind of cleared, but not completely. So I just thought something wasn't quite right. And I tried to speak to them at the hospital again, virtual. And they just said, oh, it tends to be like this. It might clear in another 6 months. Just use lubricating eye drops. And just as well, I went back to Singapore because in Singapore, I just got it checked out the day and found that I had actually developed glaucoma as a
Wow.
result of the steroidal eye drops. And the clinicians in Singapore were actually saying, didn't they follow up with you after that first month? Because this is one of the known side effects that you might actually end up with glaucoma. And of course they didn't, because the system doesn't do that. It's almost like leave us alone. Unless you're very persistent, we won't see you. So it rations that way. But because I knew something was wrong, I knew how to get help. I knew enough about what I needed to find out and who to speak to. And, I could fly to Singapore, but that was piggybacking on the family visit. But that is just not the way it should be. I mean, we are the lucky ones because we've got the resources, not just financial, but also information, confidence, and everything. Most people don't. And someone else in my position would have lost their sight. It
So
is as stark as that.
So let's
Awful.
maybe, because it's 37, I'm going to give you a really tough one to finish. And again, you've given me all the questions there. So we started talking about individual agency, the ability to drive change by joining the system up yourself. There's examples, great examples internationally. There's an organization called Bertsorg with a founder called Josta Block, who's got, thousands of nurses now that work in a charity that join up the system, home patient care, by letting district nurses work in really small key teams. But our mission is to reflect on everyone's individual's agency and ability to do what you did with the glaucoma, and without having to go to Singapore for
Yeah.
what do they call it? Global medical tourism to check into a country who can actually fix us. That probably not to be advocated. But there's a professor lady. I've just pronounced her name, Mariana Mazzucato.
Mazzucato. Yes.
That's it. Thank you for the correction. Her latest book it's called The Big Con, which takes big aim at consultants for hollowing out the capability and capacity of government through their big consultancies. And we're not talking about sole traders or Chih Hoong but it strikes me that our society is hollowing us all out, or has the potential to hollow us all out when it comes to our agency. And that is it's not just government capability and capacity. It's in charities, it's in old people young people who haven't got jobs or whatever, where we've got less and less agency rather than more. And wouldn't it be nice, she takes aim at big consultancies, but wouldn't it be nice if we could give people more permission to get on and actually solve a lot of these problems, often with government support? Or because if you take your example, it would have been far cheaper for the NHS to cure you than kill you. It's not an intended consequence of the system to make people go blind or not to, help them. The money's there. That's not a problem with money. It's not a problem with, but is there a bottom up, a mid, a sort of community up kind of way to help government officials, professors in university or whatever, actually work on solutions that empower and scale, rather than the sort of top down approach all the time?
Definitely. And I think it's interesting you started with Mariana's book, The Big Con, because that's where I go back to. I have a lot of sympathy for what you were saying. And, I used to be a consultant, and those kinds of arguments have always been around. And even now, as a freelancer, some people might still look at me as a consultant. I think it's not about whether it's consultancy or not consultancy, whether you
Mm.
work with a consultant or not. There are some technical definitions of what is meant by being a consultant. To me, what's gone wrong is that everything, as encapsulated by the consultancy model that has gone wrong, that Mariana was critiquing, is that everything has been reduced to transactions, that we have got purely transactional about everything. And that's where we've gone wrong. So to me, it's not about consultant or not consultants. To me, I think we need to shift from the transactional to the relational. That's what makes us humans. That's what makes us a society. I rant and rail at this thing that Thatcher used to say about there's no such thing as a community. Well, there is. It's because we have completely broken down the relational and replaced it with the transactional. That's when we end up with no society. So I think we need to rebuild the relational. So in everything I do, even for the technical stuff like how do you design a social impact bond, I always say to people, yes, there's a technical aspects of it, but actually, you know what? The technical aspects are the easiest bit of it. It's the relational aspects that you need attention to. But actually, Rob and Annabelle, how much in any sphere is actually written about the relational? How do people manage the relational? We've got tons of technical guides. This is what you do, follow these procedures to design a social impact bond or whatever it may be. But there's hardly anything on the relational. So it's the relational we need to focus on. So, even as a consultant, I've always said to people, I don't think of the people who pay me as my clients, and they don't think of me as their consultant or their contractor. The Abu Dhabi people that I work with, they call me their family. I've got other people call me their partner. And that is different. That is completely different. It's the same financial relationship, but the quality of that relationship and what it allows you to do is completely different because I'm not working to a specifications that's dead. I'm working in a very co-creative manner because I know something about it, so do other people. How do we create this environment and the governance and the structures around it to allow us all to bring our best to the table? Because these problems we are trying to solve in the UK and the world are not easy to solve. If they were, they would have been solved ages ago. It requires all of us to bring, our informal and formal resources to the table. But because of this lack of relational focus, it hasn't been happening. But there are glimpses of that starting to emerge. And I think we need to really get that agenda to gather momentum. We need to bring people together. I'm a big believer, and I think people have told me that, my USP, my unique selling point is I'm a bridge builder, that I bring people from different worlds together so that we can all bang our heads together to try to solve a problem, and then we leave together in the same direction. And I really believe in that kind of relational work that requires trust, requires that collective, back to risk. It's a collective management of risk in that collaborative structure. You can't just have a governance that brings people together. It's that governance is dead. You need to have a governance structure that brings people together, but also proactively builds trust, proactively builds creative problem solving. So it's not just about, oh, we've got a steering group. You know, the number of
Yeah,
times
no,
when I
no,
say about,
yeah.
yeah, when I say about these relational stuff and people go, oh, we've got a steering group. Oh, and it's got a service user on the steering group. Like that means anything? That
No,
doesn't say
how
anything.
many meetings have you been in where it's like, right, we're going to collaborate now. Let's collaborate.
Yeah.
And everybody goes home and they forget what they've done. I mean, it's just,
Yeah, or like, oh,
it's
we've got a service user in the group, so that means, you know, we've listened. Yeah,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
that's just so dead.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, wow. Thank you so much for all that. That was amazing. We will have to do a round 2, I think, in a few weeks' time.
The
But
sequel, you know,
yeah,
if John Wick,
exactly,
if we're down
exactly.
to John Wick 4 now, you can have a Chih Hoong Sin.
Well, if we can bring Keanu on, that would be cool. He's a man of social value. He's much rated as a human being, Keanu Reeves. It definitely aim for him. You can come to that one when we've got him.
I'll be the sidekick. I'll be the sidekick.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time.
It's
Thank you,
my
Rob.
pleasure.
And
Thank you, Chih Hoong.
we will see you again all soon. Thank you.
Thanks for
Bye.
inviting me.
Bye.
Bye.